And so I want to talk about that concept of food and what we're putting in. I know you said some of the best sources are, eating these leafy greens, dark leafy greens, beets. What type of dark leafy greens are we talking about? Like arugula, chard, like spinach? Are there better sources than others? Talk a little bit about the food.
I wish I had a simple answer for you, but on average, so if we kind of speak broadly, the darker the green vegetables, typically the higher the nitrate content. Mm-hmm. And you can see this, I live in rural Texas on several hundred acres. And so we know when we fertilize our pastures that the plants and the grass get a dark green versus the ones that aren't. They're deficient in nitrogen or nitrate. So it's the same thing in the vegetables or the plants we eat. So the darker the vegetable, on average, the higher the nitrate. And so that's kale, spinach, arugula, Swiss chard. Those are kind of the ones that are highest. But the other thing we realized, Jay, I guess probably in 2015, is we went around to a retail grocer in 5 cities across the U.S. We went to New York, Raleigh, Chicago, Dallas, and Los Angeles, and grabbed 5 vegetables, the same vegetables, from the same retail grocer, brought it back to the lab and analyzed the nitrate content. And even within the same vegetable category, for example, celery, if you lived in Dallas, you could eat about 6 or 7 stalks of celery and get enough nitrate to normalize your blood pressure. But if you bought the same celery from the same retail grocery in New York, you'd have to eat 50 to 60 stalks of celery.
Wow. Is that just because of where it is coming from, or because of the travel, or?
Well, no, it's based on regional farming practices and soil conditions. So we know that lightning and lightning storms fix nitrogen in the air into nitrate or ammonia through this high energy reaction. So in the areas that have a lot of lightning storms, primarily the Rust Belt in the south where these are grown, then there's more nitrate in the soil. Where up north, there's less lightning storms and probably less different farming practices. And the interesting thing is we compared that organically grown vegetables to conventionally grown vegetables, and organically grown vegetables have on average about 10 times less nitrate than conventionally grown.
Because there's no nitrogen being used as like fertilizer?
That's right.
Wow.
That's right. Because to get an organic label, you're not allowed to add any synthetic fertilizers to the soil.
That's interesting.
You can't eat enough organic vegetables to get enough nitrate in your diet to generate any nitric oxide.
So does that mean for you, because I know a lot of the listeners here are going to be like, well, oh crap, like all I eat is organic because they stay away from conventional, vegetables and fruits because, high pesticides, glyphosate, things like that could be neurotoxic. What say you? Like for you, do you have like a blend of organic and conventional, or are you just maybe not as worried with maybe potential neurotoxicity or mycotoxins of conventional farming? What's kind of your take on there?
No, of course we're worried about it because it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
There's glyphosate on everything, the corn we eat, the wheat and all this. So, you try to be smart about it. And so I eat a balanced diet and try to eat, we live in rural Texas and we eat local. Mm-hmm. And so typically when I never go to the grocery store, but my wife does all the shopping, but she typically makes wise choices for us and the kids and the family. But in terms of nitric oxide, I realize that we're never going to eat enough vegetables typically to restore our nitric oxide. Mm-hmm. The Japanese diet, we've compared this to different cultural diets, the Japanese diet, the Mediterranean diet, the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. If you follow those dietary patterns, then you probably may get enough. But most Americans are only getting about 150 milligrams of nitrate per day from their diet. And that's just the standard American diet or the SAD diet. So there's no way we can eat enough. And most Americans don't. And that's the reason most Americans are overweight, hypertensive, pre-diabetic or diabetic. I mean, that explains the entire epidemic.
So then how do we get it in? I mean, we were trying to build it, endogenously through things like exercise, or are we doing things like supplementing? Like what's kind of the best route if we're not able to get it from organically grown farming and, eating it? Where do we go from there?
Well, it's always best to give the body what it needs, and the body does its job, but you have to give it what it needs, right? So, there's standardized products out there that have a standardized amount of nitrate that you can take as a supplement. The other way is just, exercise, moderate physical exercise. Even in this aerobic exercise, it doesn't even have to be anaerobic, because when you start exercising, that tells your body, hey, I need to get extra oxygen and nutrients to the heart because my heart's beating. So what does it do? It tells the body, I need to make more nitric oxide to support the increased metabolic demand on the heart. Or I need to dilate the blood vessels in my biceps if I'm starting to lift weights because I'm using these muscles and they need more oxygen to make more ATP and energy. So how do you do that? Well, your body makes nitric oxide.
Right.
So, and then the other way is, sunlight. There's certain wavelengths of light that release nitric oxide on the skin that can even penetrate into the skin and release nitric oxide from preformed stores. There's infrared saunas that I use on a daily basis that are good at releasing nitric oxide. Again, stop doing the things that disrupt nitric oxide production like mouthwash, fluoride, and acids, and start doing the things that promote it. Eat a good balanced diet, lots of green leafy vegetables. If you have to supplement, you have to supplement. But then get outside, exercise, and enjoy life.
Yeah, I like that you're highlighting kind of these basics before biohacks is kind of what I say. So it's basically like before we go into supplementation, we need to do two different things. One of them I'm actually going to ask you about now, and then we'll talk about the other one as well. But the two different things is that we need to test. So we need to see kind of where we are, and then we need to do something about it that is kind of really at the foundation of health and well-being. And then we can start to introduce more of these kind of like hacks, as people call it, or biohacks, kind of in the end to optimize. But I do like this idea, number one, of testing nitric oxide. And people may be curious, well, like, how do I know if I'm deficient in my ability to synthesize or produce nitric oxide? And I believe that there is an answer that you may have here, but I'll leave it up to you. So how do we test our nitric oxide levels?
Well, it's a good question. And when we started maybe 20 years ago in the field, there was no way to measure nitric oxide or determine nitric oxide in patients or in humans. In about 2010, I developed a salivary nitric oxide test strip, and it was kind of the first point of care kind of indicator of what your nitric oxide levels are. So it's kind of like the urinary dipstick, but instead of putting urine on it, you just apply some saliva. You can spit on the end of the test strip. And if it turns bright pink, then that tells us that your body can generate nitric oxide, whether endogenously or it's from the bacteria that are reducing nitrate to nitrite. So that was, it gave people a sense of what their nitric oxide levels are. And, a lot of people who thought they were doing well, in good shape, and did admit that maybe they had a little bit of ED or elevation in blood pressure, the test strip reveals that and say, well, okay, you're not optimized.
Yeah.
So now what do you need to do that? So, that's been a fun little tool to use, but, I tell people it's a good tool to have in your toolbox, but it's not the only thing you should be using. Really, the true readout of your nitric oxide status is what is your blood pressure? Do you have any degree of erectile dysfunction? Do you have insulin resistance, pre-diabetes or diabetes? Do you have exercise intolerance? If you get on the treadmill and you can't go more than 2 to 3 minutes or 4 minutes, then your body's not making nitric oxide. And that's the reason you can't perform.
Yeah, really. So all of those are interconnected with deficiencies in nitric oxide. So you can do the test strips. I think those are really helpful. I picked up some of those from the website, which is I think humanin.com. Humanin.com, which is the Human Power of In. Is that right? The company that makes those. And then I used that one. And then I was actually noticing that I was not on the depleted, but the low end. So it was just kind of like the light pink, or at least that's where I think it was at. And so for me, I started doing some different things, like, kind of changing up a little bit of my exercise regimen, doing some more type breath work exercises, which I want to talk about here in just a second, about the role of breathing in nitric oxide. And then I also started supplementing with, a couple of different things that you have patents on, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong. I started using Neo 40 and then Beat Elite for workouts. And I've noticed now for the last probably 2 weeks or so, after kind of starting that protocol, that I'm optimal in all of those areas. And I've never had, any difficulties with blood pressure, with blood sugar regulation. Those just haven't been kind of, things that I've had to deal with. But it's been interesting to test with these strips and then kind of see this dominant change effect that I've seen. It's kind of exciting too, because, when you get to see change effect like on these test strips, it's exciting because you're like, okay, that means I must be actually doing something that is increasing my nitric oxide load. And off air, I was telling you too, the other thing that I've just noticed is a spike in heart rate variability, as well as a decreasing in my overall baseline readings and heart rate, which I've found fascinating as well. And this all began just with me testing to see where I was, and then making subsequent changes based on kind of those readings. Thanks for listening to the Hanu Health Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. This podcast would not happen without listeners and supporters like you. And the best way to support us and the show is to head on over to iTunes and provide us with a 5-star review. This helps us reach others and spread the good word of breathing and stress resiliency. If we read your 5-star review on air, please reach out to podcast@hanuhealth.com with your name and mailing address, and we will send you some sweet Hanu gear. Until next time, breathe better and stress less.